Well, I feel I should talk a little differently to 2 people than I would talk to 100. But what I wanted to do was to explain why we need to look at what's going on in the Middle East and South Asia, and in fact other parts of the world, somewhat differently. Because of what's going on in the world at large, and we have a habit of looking at particular things on their own and not seeing them in the larger context. And if we don't see them in the larger context, then we're not comparing them with anything. If we don't compare them with anything, then we don't really understand what's going on, because we always finish up implicitly comparing it with our own experience, and that doesn't really get us anywhere. That's why it's important to understand globalization, because globalization is the way we talk about the world as a whole. And the reason we use that term is that everything is changing faster and faster, and we're not used to dealing with change. In fact, social science has been very poor at explaining change. The best we can do usually is to compare two points in time and try to work out how things change from the first point in time to the second point in time. But that's very different from studying change as it's happening and understanding why it's happening the way it's happening. So I've put together some slides, though I've always been a little bit shy about showing PowerPoint slides ever since Steve Jobs, what did he say, something like, anybody who knows what they're talking about doesn't need PowerPoint. But the usefulness of them is that it helps to focus the attention of the people you're talking to, as long as you don't do too many of them. And I'm not going to show any pictures, actually, but simply I've tried to put onto a few slides some key ideas that may stay in your minds afterwards. The first thing we have to do is to define our terms, what we're talking about. I think the easiest way for me to change slides is to that, yeah. Should we turn a light off that's shining on them? The Arab Spring and the Taliban. We've been thinking about the Arab Spring now for nearly 3 years. So whatever it meant to us when it began, it means something different now. The summer seems to be a long time coming. And certainly what we thought of as the Arab Spring before isn't the same now. But it's important to understand. I thought there was just one the light that was shining on the screen, making it difficult to see it. But that's better. That's better.
Oh, do you want to dim it a little?
No, it's just that there was a spotlight on the screen, and but it's not there now. Thank you. It's important to remember that there was a trigger for the Arab Spring. And that was the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunis on December 17th. So that's what, 2 years and nearly 10 months ago. And what's amazing is that that set off such an enormous amount of political activity at the popular level in so many countries. And at the time, we more or less took that for granted. We accepted it for what it was. But it really needs to be explained. Why should one person terminating their own lives in one country have led to an open revolt against the government in that country to begin with, and then beyond that in so many other countries? We shouldn't take that sort of thing for granted, because it doesn't always happen. So it was a trigger that launched something, but one has to assume that there were that everybody was ready for it to begin with. So I tried to put in 2 columns on one slide all the countries in which within the next 2 months protests broke out. And this is the order in which they broke out. This is the first column, and I put in red the ones that have been causing most trouble and are still causing trouble. So after that burst of political energy in Tunisia, which got rid of the government in Tunisia, there were similar protests in Algeria, Lebanon, Jordan, Oman, Mauritania, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. I've put Egypt simply in capital letters because that has had a special significance. And then they continued to break out in Syria, Morocco, Sudan, Palestine, Iraq, Bahrain, Libya, and Kuwait. And again, it's Syria, Bahrain, and Libya that have been the most significant. Now, that's an enormous amount of political energy within 2 months. But there's been very little effort to explain why one incident in one small country in Tunisia should have led to so much political energy bursting out and a series of movements that have really changed the face of the Middle East, and we still don't know where it's going to finish up. The summer's still not here. With the spring, we can't really call it a spring anymore, but we don't know what it's going to finish up as. And it's obviously causing a lot of problems that are much more significant than just the Middle East. So that's what we've got to explain. It's obvious that, to begin with, those protests were protests against governments that had taken over in the couple of decades after the withdrawal of Western colonial regimes. So it was a protest of popular will against authoritarian governments that were in power because of Western support. They were secular movements, not religious movements. And they were, to some extent, anti-Western. But before long, within the year, they began to change color and become very different sorts of movements. They changed from being secular to sectarian. And this is something, again, that hasn't really been explained. There is a lot of discomfort about it, uncertainty about where it's leading. It makes it much more difficult for governments in the West who have interests in the Middle East to work out how their policies should accommodate what's going on. But the reason, I would suggest, for this change is that secularism is not a valid political banner against an authoritarian government that was in place because of Western support and was being turned out. But a nationalism isn't available in the Middle East because nationalism is essentially not a Middle Eastern idea. It's not in Middle Eastern history in the way it is in Western history. But Islam is a very valid and potent banner against Western influence. And so Islam came to the fore as the main motivating force for continuing the rebellion against the authoritarian regimes. In fact, if you notice, what happened in each of these countries where the rebellion has continued and the government has changed was very similar to what happened in Iran in the 1970s. People don't think of Iran in the same context as the Arab Spring, because Iran is obviously it gets reported in a very different way at the moment because of the nuclear concerns. But in fact, Iran went through a revolution in in the second half of the 1970s, which was very similar to the Arab Spring. It had a different history, but it was similarly a popular protest against an authoritarian government which was in power because of Western support. And it was led by people on the left, in fact, communists to begin with, and secularists. But before it culminated in a complete change of government, it was totally hijacked by a sectarian movement. And, of course, it produced in February 1979 the establishment of the first Islamic Republic. And that Islamic Republic has been politically very successful, well, depending on what your criteria for success are, but it's still in place, and it's still having a lot of influence on what is going on in the Middle East. So, what began as a political protest against autocratic rule was overtaken by a struggle for Islamicization first, but as soon as the main struggle becomes a struggle to establish an Islamic form of government because it would not be Western and it's the only non-Western ideology available, the struggle to Islamicize broke down into sectarian warfare to differing degrees in different countries. It's particularly bad in Syria. It's not so bad in Egypt, but it's a problem in Egypt. And it's a problem to some extent in every country because, well, Khomeini, who's well known and famous for a lot of things, has been proclaimed the man of the 20th century by more than one source, I think. And I think really is a very important figure in the 20th century because he's the first person to lead a revolution, which was a classic revolution compared to the Russian, the French, the Chinese revolutions, but it was the first one that was led by a non-Western ideology. But one of the most famous things he said was that in Islam everything is politics. And that may sound cynical, but it's significant because the problem in Islam has to do with where the authority is for interpreting the text. And in Christianity, we got rid of that problem when we pulled the rug out from under the Pope, as I'm sure everybody in Villanova knows very well, in 1517, or at least starting in 1517. But in Islam, it's been a problem from the time the death of the Prophet in 632 AD, and it continues to be a problem. And as everybody in the Islamic world becomes more aware of what is going on in the rest of the Islamic world, it becomes more and more of a problem because Islam, much more than Christianity, has always had as part of its central principles the idea that every Muslim is a member of the same community, and that is a global community. Whereas Christianity from the beginning tended to be divided up under different local communities, each with their own bishops. So this is the way the Arab Spring has developed. What about the Taliban? Taliban is a word that we've got used to, but I think there's a lot of confusion about what it really means. And it's originally it's an Arabic word that is used in Persian and this is an Arabic word with a Persian ending, but it's only used in this form in Pashto. So it's essentially a Pashto word, but it's a word that is used for students of traditional religious schools, madrasas, and it became used as the name of a movement, a political movement in Kandahar in 1994 for a similar reason. That is, somebody did something. It wasn't actually a suicide in this case. It was a religious a local religious figure stepping in and taking over a situation in such a way that it caught the popular imagination and made people feel that Islamicization was the only way to deal with the serious political problems in the country. However, the Taliban form of Islamicization, I noticed that Villanova has done the same thing that Penn has done, is take clocks out of every room so that you don't know when. So I have to keep my eye on. I was asked to speak for 35 minutes or 40 minutes at most and leave time for questions and answers at the end. The Taliban took over Afghanistan gradually in 2 years, from 94 to 96, and imposed an Islamic regime which was the Islamic regime the local religious figures thought was ideal. But it was an interpretation of Islam that grew out of a link with a religious school in India, Deoband in northern India. But most of the leaders are people who had not had a proper education, and their ideas of what was Islamic was to some extent Islamic, but it was colored by Pashtun tribal values, which were very different from the values of a lot of other people in the country, and were somewhat exaggerated and applied in a form that had never really been applied before. And this got them a bad image in the rest of the Islamic world. And they were recognized internationally only in Pakistan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And the reason those three countries recognized them was a political reason, because they had political interests in Afghanistan. The rest of the Islamic world didn't recognize them. The rest of the world didn't recognize their regime. And they had serious financial problems, and they rebelled against the West for that reason. And that's part of the reason why they supported Osama bin Laden, who actually was their guest in their own terms anyway, though they didn't, in fact, have anything to do with 9/11. And they also destroyed the Buddhas up in Bamiyan, because this part of Afghanistan was, I don't want to say that it was a Buddhist area 2,000 years ago, but around 2,000 years ago, Buddhism moved north out of India into Central Asia and was practiced for a while in northeastern Iran, much of Afghanistan, and other parts of Central Asia, which later became Muslim. So there was these gorgeous, enormous, I can't tell you the measurements, but they're really gigantic Buddhas carved out of a rock face in the Hindu Kush Mountains, which is the western extension of the Himalayas in central Afghanistan. And the Taliban smashed them with cannons because they were idols and therefore against the principles of Islam. So that, of course, made the international situation of the Taliban even worse. So since the American occupation of Afghanistan in October 2001, the Taliban went underground, and a few years later, starting around 2005, they resurfaced again in different forms, not only in Afghanistan but also in Pakistan. And so that's what, and they have been continuing to push a program that is anti-Western in each of those countries and even beyond ever since. So the third term that we have to give some sort of meaning to in order to define our terms before we try to do some explanation, is globalization. And globalization is another one of these words which has become a sort of household word, but if you ask people what it means, it's difficult to get a straight answer, or difficult to get the same answer from more than a couple of people at a time. It's interesting that globalization is a term that was probably first coined in French around 1904. That's what the Oxford English Dictionary says anyway. And was taken into English in the 1930s, but didn't get used very much, though it turns up here and there in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And then suddenly in the 1990s, it becomes a household word. Now that, again, is something that we need to understand, because not only does globalization have a history, but our awareness of it has a history. And the fact that the history of our awareness of it is different from the history of globalization makes us wonder whether the fact that we now think it's happening changes the rate at which it is happening or not. That is, do we have an effect on globalization by expecting it or not? Certainly it makes us think more in global terms. So the reason I would suggest that globalization so easily became a household term in the 1990s was that between the Second World War and 1991, we thought of the world in bipolar terms. Everything had something to do with the competition between the West and the Soviet bloc. And then the Soviet bloc disintegrated in 1991, and that left us with the default image of a unipolar world, and it wasn't long before we realized that didn't work. And the field was open for a new paradigm for explaining what was going on. And our bipolar image of the world had not taken account of the way the world was changing. We didn't think in terms of what would be the final result of bipolarism. And then when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, we suddenly became very much more aware of how much had changed and how fast things were continuing to change. And globalization was a ready-made paradigm for making sense of that. And an enormous number of people started writing about it in the 1990s, starting in 1992, actually. And the idea of a global city was formulated, and several other ideas related to how globalization works were formulated in the next 5 years. So it's become a very powerful idea for making sense of how the world is changing, even though we don't understand what's making the change work. And most of the explanations that you read and the number of books written with globalization in the title has been mushrooming since the mid-90s. And most of them focus on symptoms, that is, things you see in everyday life that make you think that the globalization must be in process. Or actual situations which are difficult to explain any other way, instead of trying to understand causes or processes. And of course nobody can agree about when globalization began. So what I want to do is offer you some causes, because I think this is the way we need to think about globalization. We need to have some sense of why it's happening now. And what I'm going to suggest to you as a way of thinking of it, making sense of it, is that globalization is the result of accelerating population growth. That is, it would not be possible without accelerating population growth. However, that on its own doesn't explain it. What you have to know in addition to the history of population growth and how it has accelerated, the fact that, for example, we hit the first billion of world population in 1810, the second billion around 1930, and then last October 7 billion, enormous rate of acceleration. But even more important than that is that starting about 7,000 years ago, the proportion of world population living in cities has accelerated faster than world population as a whole. And 100 years ago, it was still only about 10% of people living in cities, 10% of the whole world population. However, in 2007, we crossed the 50% mark, and we expect that in the next 50 years, we'll reach somewhere between 66 and 75%. And this is, of course, this changes the quality of human social life, because 50 years ago, most people in the world lived in situations in which, in the course of their lifetimes, they would only know a few dozen other people, or at most a few hundred. And now, how many friends do you have on Facebook? And it's not only how many friends you have, but the way that has changed the way you relate to everybody. So 50 years ago, you related to people because they were a particular relative, they were a particular sort of friend, they were a spouse, they were in a particular profession, and there were expected ways, so expected forms of behavior for every different type of relationship. And when you met somebody in the street and were introduced, you could sense where they fitted into society because of the way they behaved and the way they were dressed to some extent as well. But all that type of recognition has now faded, because our ability to classify in that way hasn't kept up with the numbers of people that we find ourselves interacting with in these more intense social situations. So all of us now interact with many more people in the course of a day. Not only many more, but we go through many more interactions. So our social lives are socially more intensive. And it's the intensification of social life, I think, that has changed the quality of social life and is the root cause of everything we put down to globalization. So accelerating population growth and accelerating rates of urbanization is what started it. And that leads to social intensification, which means that not only do the arenas within which people interact get denser and larger, but the arenas start to merge. But each arena has been growing at a different rate, and so is at a different stage of social intensification when it comes into contact with another arena. And because all change produces winners and losers, and the places where change is fastest produces all sorts of opportunities. But when change suddenly takes off, a lot of people feel very threatened and rebel against it and try to hold on to what they had in the past, because the values that they had in the past is what they depended upon for making life, everyday life, work. So they try to preserve the past, but in doing so they tend to idealize it, exaggerate what they remember of it. And this is in fact what has happened in Afghanistan. Another thing, of course, which is relevant to the problem of the Arab Spring is that political agendas up until the middle of the last century were generally top-down political agendas. People did what they were expected to do. Since the middle of the last century, a larger and larger proportion of the population of the world as a whole has started to develop political agendas from the bottom up. Whether that explains the failure of the US Congress to pass a budget or not, I'm not sure, but I think it has something to do with it. Globalization is not Americanization. The interesting thing is that population growth is faster outside the Western world than inside. It's interesting that population growth, which has been continuous ever since the beginning of our species some 250,000 years ago, didn't really take off anywhere until the 17th century, and that was in northwestern Europe. And that's why the Western world got ahead of the rest of the world in the last 2 centuries. But it's only since 1800 that the West has had a dominating position internationally throughout the world. Before that, it was the places that had really big cities like China and the Islamic world at the end of the medieval period where you would find the most impressive technologies. But the colonial period, what the colonial did was that it imposed an administrative straitjacket on a large proportion of the world, which inhibited change and did not lead to the sort of opportunities that encouraged population growth. But when the colonial regimes were withdrawn in the middle of the last century, population growth took off. So India had a population of 400 million in 1947, and it's now close to 1.3 billion. China similarly grew enormously over the last century, whereas so many Western countries, as you probably know, are barely maintaining their populations. In fact, some have declining populations. What the really important milestone of change in the relationship between the West and the rest, as somebody has, there's a book called The West and the Rest, which is a title I wish I had thought of myself, was the new age of revolutions that started in the 1970s, which were a very different type of political revolution than what we'd had before. So the problem is that all this process of globalization is uneven, and it's the unevennesses that are causing us all the trouble and underlie the problems that have led to what we started off by thinking of as the Arab Spring and the Taliban. Colonialism increased the unevenness by holding back the natural change in a lot of societies. And communities that are at uneven stages of intensification react against each other when they come into contact with each other, and because of the way interaction has become global, that some of that reaction has also become global, and that's why that underlies the motivation for international terrorism. And I think that we're now going through the period of greatest reaction because globalization can't homogenize the world immediately, though eventually if we become a global community, we will be, though we'll never be, I don't think human beings are capable of all becoming the same. But what has been happening in recent decades that I haven't mentioned yet, which is particularly important, is that the migration has increased. And of course, we're all liberals, or at least most of us think we are. Economic liberalism makes people want to do things across borders, but political liberalism makes us insist on borders because political liberalism insists on equal rights, and you can't establish equal rights, or at least we have no means of establishing rights and protecting rights across borders. This is the big political problem of globalization, that we don't know how to manage rights that except within the boundaries of a nation state. So the problems are especially bad in the Middle East and South Asia because it's in the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa, which where change was inhibited most for some amount of the period between around 1800 and 1960. I don't want to be interpreted as being anti-colonial, because I think Western colonialism was simply a continuation of the sort of things that a large number of different countries in the world had been doing for 2,000 years or more, 5,000 years in fact. But the particular effects of Western colonialism in the 19th and first half of the 20th century was that it inhibited change at a time when change had begun to accelerate, so that when the Western colonial administrations were withdrawn, societies that became independent began to change much faster, and it's the result of that acceleration of change that's made them try to hold on to the past and to idealize the past and to react against the West. I'm sure I'm beyond 35 minutes. Am I? The differential, so the most important factors are differential rates of population growth, and you may have come across a book called Europe and the People Without History, and I want to write a long review of that book because it's been extremely successful, and I will call my review The West and the People Without Investment. But I don't want to be misinterpreted as a Marxist. I'm not suggesting that the economic infrastructure explains everything. What I'm suggesting is that until people come together in cities, they can't harness labor to innovate. They don't have enough association of ideas and different understandings of what's going on in the world and different types of knowledge to get ideas to innovate. So if you notice that since we became aware of globalization, the rate of innovation in the Western world has skyrocketed. It's not just Apple and Microsoft, but there's and in fact, the same thing is happening in China now. The acceleration of innovation has been part of this increased intensification. So it's the amount of interaction of people with different backgrounds and different experience which makes it possible for human beings to innovate faster and keep up with the problems of population in relation to habitat. And this is just a continuation of the same thing. Which often leads people to ask whether things are going to get worse. And what I'm suggesting is that this is, in fact, the crucial phase that we're going through now, and it may get worse for a little bit, but before very long, it will get better because the unevenness will gradually even out. And the reason it will even out is that migration continues to increase. And although we build fences along the border with Mexico and other people build fences along some other borders, we try desperately to stop people crossing borders. We're incapable of stopping them from crossing borders, and sooner or later some other accommodation will have to be found. One of the first things that people predicted in the 1990s when globalization became the paradigm was that it was the end of the nation state. And a book was very soon published that argued that it can't be the end of the nation state, because without a nation state we've got no means of developing infrastructure. And without infrastructure we can't have globalization. That was a very smart argument. But I think it's wrong, because I don't know whether any of you have been to India recently. India still has the infrastructure that the British built before independence and hasn't done much to it since. And what's happened is that big corporations have started building infrastructure. Of course, they don't build it for the whole country. So there's big gaps in India's infrastructure, but that's in fact what is happening. And the American government hasn't done much to maintain our bridges since the 1950s. So there are infrastructure problems in nation states as well. So I think that the unevenness will even out, and what will happen is not that the world will become homogeneous, but that there will be continuous movement of population and a lot of differential change in different parts of the world. So you see that I assume that the future is already here, but it's just unevenly distributed. I don't know whether you've read anything by William Gibson, but he's one of the most successful science fiction writers there is. And I think that this is a crucial phase of globalization, and that's why we're, because of the rate of change and the amount of unevenness it's bringing into contact, and that it won't last. We're not through it yet. It's going to continue for a while, and there are certainly very serious risks involved in it, because yes, it could lead to a nuclear war or something like that, but I'm optimistic enough to think that we will be able to avoid that sort of thing. But there will be certainly problems in the next decade or so. And the biggest problems are going to continue to be in the Middle East, South Asia and Africa, because they were held back by colonial administrations. And of course in the Middle East and South Asia, or in northern South Asia, the problems are exacerbated by our historic religious confrontation between Islam and Christianity, and also our current strategic interests in those areas. So that's my text, and that was nearly 50 minutes.